I mean, the other thing which is very striking is the prevalence of attitudes which we would regard as outright racism today.
Yes.
I mean, cards in shop windows advertising lodgings saying no Irish, no coloured. You know, and you quote Birmingham transport workers as having, you know, planning a ballot on whether there was an objection to employing coloured workers to drive buses and so on. So, I mean, it was entirely accepted, you know, to express that kind of attitude in the 1950s.
Yes, I think we were, you know, tight little right little island really in the 50s, really quite a sort of introverted society. We didn't move about much in terms of, you know, physical mobility. As I mentioned earlier, relatively restricted social mobility. We were a society that was very suspicious of either the other, and whether the other might be, you know, a black immigrant, or it might be a homosexual person. It might just actually be anyone who was a bit different, just generally a bit different.
Well, could even Elvis Presley could, you know, cause a great deal of consternation.
He certainly did, and well, you know, the beginnings were just underway of as it were, the counterculture. Yes.
I saw one review suggesting that we could learn from the 1950s, and that, you know, without wanting to sort of patronize the past, that rather surprised me, because I thought it's difficult, other than wishing the clock to be turned back, to see how we could learn from those years. But do you think there are things which? Well,
I think I saw the same review, and also I wondered actually when I read it, I thought, other things really we can learn from the 1950s. I think there's certainly things we can look back on the 1950s and regret that they don't exist anymore, and that's largely, I think, to do with a sense of certainty in the way that society was organised. Society was organised in a very hierarchical lines, and one might disapprove of that. And I think I would disapprove of that, but nevertheless, it did give people a sense of certainty. They knew their place, as it were. And I mean, the first half of the book is called "The Certainties of Place," and I mean place both geographically and socially. And I think that's, you know, psychologically, actually, that can be very helpful to people. I mean, it was a very paternalistic era. I mean, big, you know, industry companies were organised paternalistically. You know, the large banks, for example, large companies like ICI, and obviously the nationalised industries. On the whole, you could go into them and you would know where you would be in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time. It certainly wasn't the cult of youth didn't exist in the British economy, to put it mildly. But I mean, there was a sense of two-way loyalty between employer and employee, but of course is now virtually wholly gone. And you know, there are good things to be said about the end of paternalism, but it has left a lot of people, you know, particularly now in the downturn, psychologically in a very sort of difficult, exposed state, I guess.
But you quote a report, I think, from 1954 on social mobility. So the concept of social mobility and the thought that things were beginning to shift was already present from the mid-50s.
I think it was. You just start to sort of see it. Just start to see it coming through. I mean, one or two of the politicians sort of have a sense of social mobility about them. The Tories with Ian MacLeod, who wasn't really sort of old school Tory, very clever, sharp man. It's just starting to come through a little bit in the culture. You mentioned Elvis. I mean, skiffle came, of course, in the same year in '56, which was a great kind of do-it-yourself kind of musical revolution. At the very end of my period, virtually on the last page of my book, actually, I mention Flanders and Swan at the drop of a hat had its first outing, and there was a sort of irreverence there that, in a sense, was a precursor of the sort of satirical revolution, the satire revolution that lay ahead of the next 10 years or so. So, you know, they're just sort of inklings of it. And in terms of lack of deference, I think we see some inklings as well, which is part of these sort of these changes. A couple of things there, really. As early as 1952, after King George died, he died on a Wednesday, and the state funeral wasn't until the Friday of the following week, so 9 days later. Yeah. And basically, the BBC over those 9 days shut down its whole entertainment side. So none of the soaps and none of the comedies and none of the variety shows and so on were broadcast. And people got very, very fed up with it. And, you know, so there's a bit of left over. And also over the Princess Margaret episode, the question of who she should marry, people felt very strongly about it. And when she renounced Townsend in 55, people were extremely cross with the church, specifically, and the establishment as a whole, for having thwarted young love and so on. So there are signs of it, but on the whole, the fuller flowering of change is really sort of the pace of change generally, social and economic, really picks up from the late 50s, but it's just beginning to increase from the mid 50s.